Thanks for tuning in to Healthy Planet One, where we discuss healthy living from experts in each of their fields. This is your host, Patricia Starr.
And your co-host, Kimberly Knock.
Welcome, everyone. Our guest on Healthy Planet One is Charlotte Jones, who is a Master of Science and a prepared registered nurse. We are going to be talking about healthy mind, body, and spirit in two parts, because we have a lot to talk about. Welcome, Charlotte. Nice to have you with us.
Thank you, Patricia. And hello, Kimberly. I'm glad to be here.
So I've known Charlotte for a long time, and I've known her to be an excellent nurse. She was in Sarasota Memorial Hospital for 7 years, right, Charlotte?
A little shy of that, correct, yes.
And then you were very involved with other type of care, and after being off the floor for 12 years, you actually volunteered to go to New York City during the height of the pandemic there. And that was an interesting experience. And I'm not going to say anything more about that because I want you to jump in and share what that actually triggered for you and how that's gotten you to where you are today.
Oh, wow. That's a really loaded question. We need a lot more than a half hour, but I'll try to sum it up quickly. How's that?
That's fine.
Believe it or not, it actually goes back to 9/11, 2001. I was working in labor and delivery at Sarasota Memorial that day, and I saw the first plane crash, and I saw the second plane crash. And without knowing it, I became traumatized. And last January, when I started hearing about the pandemic, and I'm following the news, and I'm watching, and I'm like, when's it coming? It's only a question of when. It was never a question of it coming. It was just, when's it coming and what can I do? I felt very urgent to go help. As a nurse, I think that you just have that, like you have to go help. And you don't want to feel helpless. So at the beginning of March, I actually contacted the Board of Nursing in Florida, and I asked what I can do, and they said, you can volunteer. And I'm like, no, I don't think so. A friend of mine found out about an agency up in New York City. They were paying top dollar, $10,000 a week to work up in New York City. And there's a reason why you get paid that kind of money. And I went up there. It was a cattle call on, I think it was like Friday, April 3rd. You can double check the dates. If I'm wrong by a day, forgive me. I was on a flight, though, by Sunday. So 2 days later, I was up in New York City expecting to stay there until June. That was my game plan. It was a whirlwind. That's all I can tell you. The things that they told us during orientation definitely gave me pause. They had told us that the governor had lifted sanctions. So basically, don't worry about your nursing license. You're safe to do whatever, which didn't hit me right personally. That's not my standard of practice. Mm-hmm. And I knew that I was very limited in where I could practice as a nurse because I'd worked to labor and delivery only, which is fine. But I wasn't willing to go outside of my scope of practice, what I knew I could do safely, no matter what the conditions of coronavirus be damned. So I went up there, and my first few shifts were great. And then my last two were the worst things I've ever witnessed as a nurse. And in hindsight, I can tell you that whole entire unit was suffering from compassion fatigue. And compassion fatigue is a little bit more than burnout syndrome. It happens over time. It's when those that are always filled with compassion are too weary to give anymore. And I had a patient whose pain never got controlled, and I couldn't do anything as a nurse. And the next day, I saw something else that I knew what was going to happen before it happened, and they were very, how do I say this, slower than I would have expected for an emergency situation. So based on my previous knowledge of how I've known things to work, I previously worked, just FYI, as a new nurse in a teaching hospital. So I worked with residents way back when in Baltimore City. So I was trained with residents. I knew what to do. The level of education and knowledge I was given in high risk was much different. But because in New York City and the way that this unit was run, they didn't want what a nurse had to say. It was only up to the residents and the doctors. And as a nurse, I basically had to keep my mouth shut. At the end of my shift that I ended up leaving and going back home after, my charge nurse said the following question to me. She said, "Miss Jones, how's it going?" And my response was, to be perfectly honest, I think I'm a hindrance to your unit. And she said back, you just might be. And I literally split in two as the nurse that I knew I could be and the nurse I would have to be to stay there. And I said, I can't help them. This is not a coronavirus issue, even though corona was an outlying factor for what happened, because they were short-staffed. So even though they might not be dealing with it directly, they were being impacted. So I came home completely burnt out and fried, and I can only tell you that I was a shadow of myself, Patricia. And I could have easily gone on the dark side. I kept saying I had PTSD. My friend's like, no, you have acute stress disorder. She's a social worker. Now she tells me I have PTSD because of other things have come up afterwards. But I'm also a poster child. I mean, I am now thriving, and it took a while. And then you say, well, what happened?
So let me ask you a question, Charlotte, if I may. At that moment when you left your shift, and you said, and I don't want to understand this, I want our listeners to understand it. When you left your shift and you were asked that question and you said, I may be, did you say a detriment to your unit? What did that mean? Hindrance. What did that mean?
So what that meant is the type of nursing I knew how to practice was not the type of nursing they practiced there. I was taught to be a very autonomous nurse. I was taught I'm very valuable as part of the healthcare team. I'm telling you what's going on with the patient because I know because I'm there. They don't practice like that. The way they practice there is the residents told you what was going on and you followed just what they told you to do.
Oh, so in other words,
different.
In other words, all of your experience had no bearing at all in the situation. You watched somebody suffer in a way that they didn't need to. Is that what you're saying?
Exactly. Twice. 2 different patients. 2 different issues.
So that's totally undermines your self-esteem in a way, doesn't it, right?
Well, it definitely makes a person who goes there to help feel helpless. And one of the worst things that can ever happen to a healer and a helper is to not be able to help. And when you realize you can't, like, my voice just got completely repressed and suppressed, and I knew I could be of no help. And that's not what I went up there to do. I went up there to help. And, you know, people can say, oh, you were only up there for 2 weeks. You know what? You experienced what I did for that period of time, you'd be running back too. I was just able to. I had the luxury of not having to stay and put up with it. Many nurses don't have that luxury, and many nurses don't know that they're suffering the way that I was.
And you watched that firsthand, didn't you?
Oh, my God. Well, I watched it. I've watched it more since I've been back than I have when I was up there. How's that?
How is that?
Up there for 2 weeks. Because I am on all of these messenger posts on Facebook and on LinkedIn, and I'm connected with all these nurses that are still working in the fields, that are still in the front lines. They're in Texas. They're in all different areas. When I'd already come back from New York, I was still watching the boards. I was getting part of the text messaging chains. I was seeing what was going on. I still see it. I still hear it. And it's frightening. And I don't think people realize, like, what the real repercussions are when you start telling nurses you have to work 84 hours a week. When do they ever get to rest? And if they're not resting, they can't take care of anyone else because they're not optimal. Like, they're just burnt out, and they don't even know that they're only operating in their sympathetic nervous system. They're just barely surviving.
So this is a really important thing. Can you share with us some of the things that the average layperson, you know, we celebrate the heroes of the front line, but you're giving a different view in terms of the fact that they're actually going through, are they not being heard? Are they not being cared about? What's the actual thing that you're seeing from these boards, if you can share with us?
Sure. Well, let me go a little bit backwards first before I answer that 100%.
Sure.
When you're in nursing school, you are trained to be leaders. You are trained about health promotion. You are trained about leading people to optimal wellness. Mm-hmm. That's what you're trained for as nurses. Most people do not realize that. So let me get that clarified first. Yes, we medically intervened. We're trained to do that. We have many skills. We have much knowledge. We have much more than most people know because we never tell people what we do. We just do it. So that's part of its own repression in itself, because we're just like, oh, we just do everything. And then we don't say no a lot of times because we just want to help. But there's a cost with the helping and the not asking for help. They're saying it's enough. And the newer programs are now starting to tell nurses, newer nurses, you understand, not the old ones, you need to take care of yourselves. Well, that sounds great. But you know what? When I was up in New York, I went 16 hours straight without peeing, eating, or drinking.
What?
That's reality. Yeah, that's reality. When I used to work at SMH, I would leave my house, come back 14 hours later and say, did I pee today? And people say, that's not true. Really, come work in my shoes, because it is.
Oh, my gosh.
That's how it works a lot of times. People don't know what we do, and we don't tend to complain because we need to take care of our patients.
Yeah.
We're too busy doing our jobs to complain. We can't speak up because we're too busy taking care of the patients. There are some nurses right now that are taking care of up to 20 patients. Tell me how that's even possible. And it's so far out of unsafe scope of practice. Like, as nurses, we're supposed to do certain things. We're supposed to take care of people safely. I can't take care of 20 people safely. I can't even keep my eyes on them. How many times do you think I'm going to see them in a 12-hour shift? It's unreasonable. You're not giving me any time to stop. So that when you speak up, by the way, well, then don't come into work tomorrow. Well, that's really funny, because right now, don't you need us more than we need you?
Yes, that's what I don't understand, the ego part of it. During a time of immense care, the delegation of care should be clear so that there's better service and the lack of ego, yet it seems all egocentric.
Well, it is, and the problem is, and you hate to say it, but it's medically centered. So with healthcare being medically centered, we're focusing on sick people. We're not focusing on the health of others. And when you work in a hospital setting, you're so inundated of the illness and the sickness, you can't think of anything else. And that's the problem. And you just want to fix it, but you're not fixing it or making it worse. And when we're looking short-term and long-term, because that's really what it's about too, yes, the patients are a big deal. But if the nurses don't take care of themselves first, they can't take care of the patients. And they can't take care of their fellow nurses, who, by the way, usually kill each other. If you haven't heard, nurses tend to eat their young, old, and in between if they're weak. Oh. They don't tend to be supportive. They tend to be non-compassionate. Why? Because they're fighting for survival. This was happening before coronavirus. This just made it worse.
The coronavirus has made it worse, is what you're saying, right?
Yes, absolutely, because the pressure on the staff is even higher now than it ever was before, no matter what unit you're on. Because you have people sick, and what's going to happen, people are going to float onto other units that they're not comfortable with, so they don't even know how to give the proper care that they really want to give, so that adds to their stress, which decreases their immune function, by the way, which is so helpful.
Oh, my goodness. It's a vicious,
crazy circle. Right.
It's a vicious cycle for sure. So, and all of this is a contributing factor to the stress disorder, whether you want to call it PTSD or compassion fatigue or anything. All of this is just compiles on top of it, right? Is what you're saying?
Yes, that's exactly what I'm saying. And I know it's not just nurses, right? We know it's not just healthcare. There are so many other areas that's happening too. I'm focusing on the nurses specifically because if you don't have the healers healing people, who's going to heal you? Who else is there? There's no one that can take the place. So
you're on a mission, I understand, right?
Yes, I have a few missions. I think the biggest one is potentially up to 40% of nurses are going to be struggling with mental trauma and or stress disorders, including compassion fatigue and burnout syndrome. The normal was 15 to 20% before this virus, and now obviously it's increased. I want the nurses to know what the signs and symptoms are, but before they can even worry about that, they've got to worry about self-care. And when I'm talking about self-care, I'm not talking about what most people think about. I believe exercise is important, but I don't look at it as a different level of self-care. When I'm thinking about self-care, it's really that mind, body, spirit, connecting with that higher power, connecting with my own intuitiveness. It's so funny. Nurses are trained to actively listen and not to judge, but they do it to themselves all the time. They actively judge themselves all the time, and they don't listen to their own well-being. when it says, it's enough already. You need a rest. This is happening. Now I'll worry about tomorrow.